Okay, so we're going to first start by talking about the stop skill. So when emotion mind takes over, you may find that you often act impulsively without thinking. And when you do react impulsively, you don't have time to use your skills and get to your wise mind. So to be able to use your skills, you need to first stop yourself from reacting. And that's where the stop skill can be really helpful. So what is it? The first part is S for stop. So when you feel your emotions are about to take control, stop. Don't react. Don't move a muscle. Just freeze. Freezing for a moment helps you prevent you from doing what your emotions want you to do, act without thinking. So stay in control. Remember, you're the boss of your emotions. So if someone says something that provokes your anger, like maybe they call you names, they curse at you, you might have the urge to attack back, right? Like verbally or physically. But that, however, might not be in your best interest. So doing that could result in you getting hurt, getting in trouble. So in that situation, stop, freeze, and don't act on your impulse to attack. The next one is T is for take a step back. So if you are faced with a difficult situation, it may be hard to think about how to deal with it on the spot, like in that moment. So give yourself time to calm down and think about it. So you could take a step back literally or in your mind from the situation just to get unstuck from what's going on. Take a deep breath. Continue doing that for as long as you need to until you're back in control. But don't let your emotion control what you do. Remember that you're not your emotion and you don't have to let it put you over the edge. So if you're crossing the street and you don't notice a car approaching, let's say, and maybe the driver stops and gets out of the car, maybe they start cursing and yelling at you, maybe they physically push you, your urge might be to push back, right? However, that could probably escalate the situation and you both get in trouble or get hurt. So you first stop and you might literally take a step back in that situation to avoid confrontation. The next step is to observe. So observe what's happening around you and within you, who's involved, what other people are doing or saying. To make effective choices, it's important to not jump to conclusion. So instead, gather relevant facts so that you can understand what's going on and what your options are. So use your mindfulness skills of observing and non-judgmentalness. And the last step is to proceed mindfully. So ask yourself, what do I want from this situation? What are my goals? What choice might make the situation better or worse? Ask your wise mind how to deal with this problem. Being mindful is the opposite of acting impulsively, right? And acting without thinking. So when you're calm, stay in control, and have some information about what's actually going on, you're better prepared to deal with the situation effectively without making it worse. So let's say you get home late from work. Maybe you got a flat tire. Your partner starts yelling at you, maybe accusing you of cheating or lying. Maybe they're calling you names. So in response, you get really angry and maybe your first impulse is to yell and call names back, right? Like attack back. However, you do want to deal with this skillfully. So you stop, you take a step back from your partner, you start observing. So maybe you notice that your partner appears to drink alcohol. There's a lot of empty bottles of beer in the kitchen. You know that if your partner's under the influence of alcohol, there's probably not a lot of point in arguing, and they might be more likely to apologize in the morning. So you choose to proceed mindfully by explaining the flat tire, pacifying your partner, and then you just go to bed. You're going to postpone that discussion until the next morning. The next set of skills are pros and cons, so deciding between two courses of action. So when would you use pros and cons? So you could use pros and cons to compare the advantages and disadvantages of different options. So when you have to make a decision between two or more options, which we always often do, and you want to examine their advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons can be very important in helping you make a wise choice. So we all probably use pros and cons some of the time. It might just be more implicitly, like we're not aware of it to make decisions. So a simple example might be my alarm goes off at 6 a.m. on a work day. I'm super tired and I just want to stay in bed. I might say to myself, oh, it would feel so good to just keep staying in bed and sleeping. But then I might say to myself, oh, if I stay in bed, I'm going to be late for work and then my boss will be really angry with me. So I end up getting up. Pros and cons can also be helpful to resist impulsive or destructive urges. So they can help you resist urges to act impulsively or do things that are destructive, particularly if you're in your emotion mind. So pros and cons can help us all resist urges to quit and give up on life, to resist actions such as using drugs, maybe binging and purging, or having angry outbursts. So many individuals react to uncontrollable stress and crises by doing things that in the short run, the long run, or both are damaging to their self-interest and their well-being. So these might be things such as using drugs or alcohol excessively to escape difficult emotions or situations. Maybe you're overeating because you're distressed. Maybe you're throwing a tantrum or saying things when you're angry that you later regret. Or maybe threatening or attempting suicide when you're upset or experiencing really intensely and painful emotions. So how do we actually do pros and cons, right? So the first step would be describe the crisis behavior. So describe the crisis behavior you're trying to stop. It could be any behavior that in the short run, long run, or both is damaging to your self-interest and well-being. Next, you want to examine the advantages and disadvantages of the behavior. So the pros and cons of that crisis behavior or acting on your crisis urges. You want to consider next both short-term and long-term consequences. So when you're doing pros and cons, don't forget to consider both short and long-term consequences of that behavior. So relief and feeling better immediately might be pros, maybe short-term consequences of drinking excessively, using drugs, or yelling at someone. But having a hangover that interferes with work or ruining a relationship due to using substances or yelling in anger, all cons, maybe the long-term consequences of the same behaviors. You want to consider the pros and cons for each different crisis urge. So you want to make up a separate list of pros and cons for each different crisis urge you are working on. So if you're deciding among using illegal drugs, filing for a divorce, quitting a job, or like another impulsive action, it's important to consider the pros and cons of each action separately. It's also important to write separate lists for the pros and cons of not engaging in these actions. Then next, you want to rehearse those pros and cons multiple times. So rehearsing the pros of resisting urges and the cons of giving into urges multiple times before overwhelming urges hit. So such rehearsal makes it more likely that the pros of avoiding that destructive behavior and the cons of engaging in destructive behavior will pop into your mind when needed. The idea here is to get thinking about the long-term benefits of avoiding destructive behavior to become stronger, and thinking about immediate benefits of destructive behavior to become weaker. So this is an example of what a list would look like. So you have your pros and cons column. So the first row is acting on crisis urges. So the pros of acting on those impulsive urges, giving in, giving up, or avoiding what needs to be done. And then listing the cons. And then resisting crisis urges on the bottom row. So what are the pros of resisting impulsive urges, doing what needs to be done, and not giving up? And then what are the cons of those? So then when an overwhelming crisis urge does hit, review your pros and cons. Read that list over and over again. If it's not available, then that would be the time to write up pros and cons again. However, that can be tricky to do if you're in emotion mind, so it's advisable to solicit support from someone else for doing pros and cons when you are in a crisis. And then you want to say no to crisis urges. It can be very helpful to say out loud or even yell no when an overwhelming emotion or urge hits. Once this is done, it's important to distract yourself from the urge and from tempting events. Say to yourself, no, that's it. There is no going back, or something similar like that. All right, thank you very much for your time.